Welcome to my channel.
PC Hamish Macbeth had every intention of avoiding work that morning, and he was doing an excellent job of it. Christmas Eve had crept over Whodunit like a guilty secret, muffled by mist and a thin fall of snow that never quite committed itself to becoming festive. The mountains crouched around the village, dark and watchful, their shoulders dusted white as if they had dandruff. A bitter wind came scudding down from the moors, rattling the bare branches and making the harbour water slap irritably against the stones. Hamish sat in the back of the police station, boots off, feet dangerously close to the small stove, nursing his third cup of coffee. The station smelled of damp wool, burned grounds, and dog. Lugs lay sprawled on his back, paws in the air, snoring gently and contributing to the illusion that nothing of importance was likely to happen that day. Hamish, red-haired and long-limbed, with the faintly startled look of a deer who had learned early that standing still was often the best defence, stared into his mug and sighed with deep contentment. Christmas, he reflected, was a terrible time for crime. Too many people about, too much cheer, too much forced kindness that made folks snappish underneath. But Whodunit, thank heavens, was immune to most of it. The villagers had grudgingly agreed to put up tinsel on the hotel door and a crooked tree in the square, but nobody had gone so far as to sing, which was just how Hamish liked it. He had just reached for the biscuit tin, empty, cursed the hands of Mrs. McLean, when the phone rang. Hamish stared at it as if it were a snake. It rang again, shrill and demanding, cutting clean through the peace. Lugs opened one eye, considered the situation, and went back to sleep. "Ah, go away," Hamish muttered. But the phone was not a thing that could be shamed into silence. With a sigh heavy enough to move furniture, he picked it up. "Police station," he said, letting his voice droop. "Hamish," came the sharp voice of the desk. "Sergeant from Strathbane. You awake?" "Only just," said Hamish truthfully. "Well, wake up properly. There's been a complaint." "A complaint," Hamish repeated. Complaints were manageable. Complaints could be soothed. Complaints did not involve paperwork in triplicate. About what? About a newcomer. English. Staying at the hotel. Causing trouble. Hamish closed his eyes briefly. "Of course," he said. "Christmas. He says someone's stolen his car keys," the sergeant went on, "and he's threatening to go to the papers. That'll be the Oban Times," Hamish said. "They'll have a field day. Just see what you can do," snapped the sergeant. "And don't encourage him." Hamish hung up, finishing the last of his coffee with mournful resignation. English newcomers were like midges, noisy, persistent, and impossible to swat without consequences. He pulled on his boots, shrugged into his uniform coat, which had seen better decades, and whistled for lugs. "Come on then," he said. "Let's go and admire the Sassenach." The Whodunit Hotel stood at the edge of the loch, squat and grey, its windows glowing with reluctant warmth. Inside, the air was thick with peat smoke and the faint smell of overcooked turkey. Mrs. McLean bustled behind the bar, her expression already pinched. "He's upstairs," she hissed the moment she saw Hamish. "In the best room. Complaining about the view." Hamish raised an eyebrow. "The loch's been there a while." "Aye, well, he says it's gloomy." Hamish knocked on the door to the best room with studied mildness. "It's the police," he called, "local variety." The door was yanked open to reveal a man in his mid-40s, sleek as an otter and twice as slippery-looking. He wore a cashmere jumper that had never known rain, and his hair was carefully tousled in a way that suggested mirrors and time. The room behind him was littered with expensive luggage and the aggressive scent of aftershave. "About time," the man snapped. "Do you have any idea how things are done?" "In London?" Hamish gave him a slow, friendly smile. "No, sir, never been." The man sniffed. "My name is Gerald Fitzroy Smythe. I'm a property developer." "Of course you are," Hamish said. "I've come up here for a peaceful Christmas," Gerald continued, "and instead I'm being subjected to petty theft. My car keys are missing." Hamish glanced around. "And the car? In the car park. And the keys were where? On the dresser. I'm not an idiot." Hamish thought privately that this was debatable, but he nodded. "Anyone else in the room?" "No." "Anyone been in?" "Only the maid." And she looked shifty. Hamish made a mental note. Everyone in Whodunit looked shifty to outsiders. It was the eyes. Too much thinking. "I'll have a word," Hamish said. "They've a habit of turning up again." "That's it?" Gerald spluttered. "You're not going to dust for fingerprints?" Hamish blinked. "Dust? This is unbelievable." "Aye," said Hamish pleasantly. "We get that a lot." As he turned to go, Gerald added, "I'm looking to buy property here, you know. Turn this place into something worthwhile. Hamish paused, hand on the door. Careful, he said mildly. The place might object. Outside, the wind had picked up, scattering snow like thrown salt. Hamish stood for a moment, looking out over the loch, his good mood quietly leaking away. Englishmen with money always brought trouble. They smiled too hard, talked too fast, and never understood that Whodunit survived precisely because it did not wish to be improved. He was just considering going back to the station for another coffee when he noticed something odd. At the far end of the hotel car park, half hidden behind a drift of snow, lay a shape that did not belong. Hamish squinted. Then he sighed. Christmas, he said again. Lugs trotted ahead, tail wagging, as Hamish approached the shape. One glance was enough to confirm it. A body, face down in the snow, one expensive leather shoe missing, the other sticking up at an angle that suggested indignity rather than peace. Hamish rubbed his face with both hands. So much for a quiet day, he murmured. Above him the clouds thickened and the wind howled down from the mountains, as if Whodunit itself were laughing. Hamish stood very still for a moment, the wind tugging at his coat, the snow settling on his hair like unwanted decoration. He did not need to turn the body over to know exactly who it was. Gerald Fitzroy Smythe had finally stopped complaining. Hamish felt no triumph, only irritation, sharp and immediate. A murder meant paperwork, phone calls, and the inevitable arrival of people who would make a noise. It also meant Christmas was ruined. He crouched beside the body, ignoring the way his knees protested, and nudged the shoulder with professional reluctance. The man rolled onto his back, eyes open, mouth twisted as if mid-argument. There was a faint smell of whiskey and something sharper, fear perhaps, or panic. Snow had already begun to settle into the lines of his face, softening him. Hamish checked for a pulse out of habit, though he knew it was useless. Dead as the season's goodwill, he muttered quietly, careful to keep his voice low in case the mountains were listening. He straightened slowly and looked around the car park. There were no obvious footprints besides his own, and the blur of snow that covered everything else. If someone had dragged the body here, the weather was already conspiring to erase the evidence. Whodunit did not like to keep secrets long, but it was very good at hiding them briefly. Hamish sighed, pulled out his phone, and dialed the number he had been hoping to avoid all day. Blair answered on the third ring, already sounding angry. "What is it now, Macbeth?" "There's been an accident," Hamish said mildly. "An accident?" Blair barked. "Aye," said Hamish. "The English gentleman from the hotel appears to have fallen over and died." There was a pause, then a string of inventive curses. "Don't touch anything, Blair." Snapped. "I'm on my way." Hamish slipped the phone back into his pocket, unsurprised. He fetched a blanket from the boot of his car and covered the body, more out of decency than regulation. Lugs sat obediently nearby, ears pricked, as if aware something important had happened. By the time Blair's cars arrived in a spray of gravel and temper, half the village had gathered at a discreet distance. Mrs. McLean hovered like a worried hen, while the postmistress whispered eagerly to anyone who would listen. Blair stormed out of his car, red-faced, coat flapping, eyes already fixed on Hamish. "You useless lump," he roared. "Why am I finding bodies in your patch?" Hamish gave a small shrug. "They do wander in," he said. Blair turned to his officers and began issuing loud, contradictory orders. He barely glanced at the body before declaring it an obvious robbery gone wrong. "English idiot flashing money," Blair sneered. "Probably picked up a local thief." Hamish said nothing. He noticed, instead, that one glove lay discarded near the hedge, thin and unsuitable for the cold. Gerald had worn two earlier. Hamish tucked the detail away, along with the memory of whiskey on the man's breath and the missing shoe. While Blair shouted, Hamish drifted toward the hotel entrance, already thinking about a cup of tea. Whatever had killed Gerald Fitzroy Smythe had not happened by chance, and someone in Whodunit knew exactly how and why. Hamish intended to find out quietly, before Blair arrested the wrong person and ruined more than Christmas. Inside the hotel, warmth closed around him, thick with gossip, barely held back by politeness. Mrs. McLean poured tea without being asked, her eyes bright. "Terrible business," she said. "Him lying there like that." Hamish wrapped his hands around the mug, listening. Outside, snow continued to fall, patient and relentless, as Whodunit began, once again, to whisper. The whispers would grow louder soon. Hamish sipped his tea and waited. Christmas had come early this year. bringing lies instead of gifts. He suspected the village was already choosing which truths to hide. And that, Hamish thought, was always the interesting part. He leaned back, eyes half closed, looking every inch the lazy Constable Blair despised. Underneath, his mind was already moving, slow and careful, like water finding cracks in stone. Someone had walked with Gerald into the cold, and someone had walked away alone. Hamish meant to discover which villager carried that silence. He finished his tea, stood, and prepared to mooch. There were plenty of doors left to knock on, and Christmas Eve in Whodunit was only just beginning. The storm outside seemed to agree. It rattled the windows and laughed softly at human plans. Hamish smiled faintly, unseen. There would be no peace until the truth surfaced. Whodunit demanded its answers, even at Christmas. And Hamish Macbeth was very good at listening, especially when everyone else was shouting. He opened the door and stepped back into the cold. Behind him, the village breathed and watched in silence now. Hamish stepped away from the hotel doorway and let the cold settle around him, the tea warming his hands but doing little for his mood. The car park was now cordoned off with fluttering tape, Blair's men stomping about as if noise alone might frighten answers out of the snow. Hamish wandered past them, ignored by design and inclination, and paused beside the low stone wall where villagers had begun to gather. They stood in small knots, scarves pulled high, eyes bright with fear and excitement that Christmas rarely provided. Hamish leaned an elbow on the wall, looking as if he were merely watching the weather. He listened. Mrs. McLean's voice carried first, lowered but urgent. "I always said he was trouble," she murmured, strutting about, asking questions about land prices and old deeds. Hamish filed that away. Old deeds were rarely interesting until someone wanted them badly. The postmistress spoke. Next, breath steaming. "He was drunk last night," she said. "He argued with someone in the bar." "Who?" Hamish asked mildly, not looking at her. She hesitated, eyes flicking toward the hotel windows. "Someone local," she said finally. That narrowed it down very little. Hamish thanked them all with a nod and wandered off again, lugs padding faithfully beside him. He did not approach Blair, who was currently berating a constable for standing in the wrong place. Instead, Hamish took the long way round, heading toward the row of cottages near the shore. If Gerald had argued with someone, it would have been someone who had known him well enough to be annoyed. Hamish stopped at the first cottage and knocked, patient as snowfall. Elspeth Grant opened the door, her dark hair pinned up, eyes sharp with immediate understanding. "It's happened," she said, letting him in. The room smelled of baking and wood smoke. Hamish sat without being asked, hands cradling another mug she placed before him. "Did Gerald come here last night?" he asked. Elspeth snorted. "He tried," she said. "Wanted to know who owned what land and why they wouldn't sell. Did you tell him?" "I told him to go back to London," she said, lips thinning. Hamish nodded. "Did he leave quietly?" Elspeth hesitated. "No," she said. "He met someone on the road." "Who?" She shook her head. "Didn't see," she said, "but they weren't friendly." Hamish finished his tea and stood, thanking her softly. Outside, the snow fell thicker, muting sound and sense alike. Hamish walked on, mind ticking steadily. Gerald had upset someone local, wanted land, lost a shoe, and smelled of whiskey. That suggested a meeting that had gone wrong. He reached the last cottage, lights on, door ajar. Inside, old Mr. Macpherson sat staring at the fire. He looked up slowly. "You hear about the Englishman," he said, not asking. "Aye," said Hamish. "He offered me money," Macpherson continued. "Said he could make things better. Did you believe him?" Macpherson laughed, short and bitter. "No," he said, "but someone else might have." Hamish thanked him and left, the answer settling uneasily in his mind. Someone else indeed. As he walked back toward the hotel, he saw Blair arguing with Mrs. McLean, finger-jabbing. Hamish kept walking. He did not yet know who had killed Gerald, but he knew why it had happened. Money, pride, and the Highland hatred of being pushed. Someone had walked Gerald out into the cold and let nature and anger do the rest. Hamish felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Blair would charge the wrong person by morning. Hamish would have to stop him without being noticed. He smiled faintly, already planning his next cup of tea. The night closed in early, Christmas lights flickering weakly against the dark. Somewhere in the village, a killer was listening too. Hamish slowed, letting the silence stretch, knowing it would speak soon. Snow crunched softly under his boots, each step measured, unhurried, deceptive. He passed the dark shop fronts, the church spire a pale finger pointing nowhere. Whodunit held its breath, waiting to see who would crack first. Hamish intended to let them sweat. Back at the station he fed lugs, stoked the stove, and wrote nothing down. The truth would come, as it always did, through carelessness and talk. Hamish settled into his chair, listening to the wind and smiling like a fool. Outside, Blair shouted orders into the cold, convinced he was in control. Hamish closed his eyes, content to wait. Christmas had given Whodunit a corpse, and it would demand payment. Hamish would make sure it was paid by the right hands. He listened harder, hearing fear beneath the quiet. Someone would slip. They always did, especially at Christmas. Hamish waited, patient, unseen, exactly where he belonged. The snow kept falling, hiding lies until morning. Morning comes. The next morning arrived with a brittle, icy light that made Whodunit look older and smaller, as if the snow had compressed the village into something manageable. Hamish emerged from his cottage, lugs at his heels, his boots crunching softly over the frozen paths. The wind had dropped to a whisper, though the mountains still loomed like silent sentinels. He paused at the station, the kettle on the stove hissing welcome, and poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, savouring the way it cut the chill from his fingers. Blair had already arrived, red-faced and pacing, his boots slapping against the floor as if announcing the arrival of a catastrophe. Hamish made a show of yawning and stretching, careful to appear far less interested than he actually was. Blair came at him immediately. "Macbeth, what have you been doing while I'm trying to control this mess? We could have had this cleared up hours ago." His voice cracked under the strain of indignation. Hamish raised one eyebrow and sipped his coffee. "I've been, supervising," he said lazily, letting the word hang in the air like a puff of smoke. Blair's hands flew to his hips. "Supervising? You? Don't make me laugh. I've got officers outside, freezing their socks off while you sit here twirling your thumbs." Hamish merely nodded, taking another slow sip. Outside, lugs poured at the door impatiently, ready for anything less formal than police procedures. Hamish considered stepping out, thinking that listening outside might yield more than Blair's barking ever would. The inspector's attention was fixed on the formalities: photographs, notebooks, and the most obvious suspect, a local man named Dougie Macpherson, who had been seen near the hotel the night before. Dougie looked like he had swallowed a porridge pot and was being interrogated for it. Hamish noted, without comment, that Dougie's alibi, staying home with his mother, was solid enough. Yet Blair ignored the subtle clues that Hamish had already spotted. Teacups and scones appeared mid-morning at the hotel, brought by Mrs. McLean herself, who delivered them with a glare that suggested anyone touching the food without permission would be cursed. Hamish accepted a plate, settling at a small table with lugs quietly underfoot. "You're not supposed to eat," Blair shouted across the room, glaring as if consumption itself were a crime. Hamish chewed slowly, savouring the buttery scone, while Blair turned redder by the second. "It's important to keep up appearances," Hamish said, loud enough for the postmistress to hear. Blair stormed over. "Appearances? I'll teach you about appearances, you lazy fool." Hamish ignored him, letting Blair's fury ricochet around the room while he observed quietly. He listened to villagers as they passed, each offering tiny slips of information: a heated argument at the bar, a vanished parcel of papers, a glance that lingered too long in someone's direction. Nothing that looked significant to Blair, who was already convinced Dougie had done it, but everything meaningful to someone who understood human nature as Hamish did. The subtlety of lies, the pauses in speech, the fleeting looks, these were the threads he would follow. Priscilla, Halbert and Smythe, who had arrived for a brief Christmas stay and always managed to appear in the right place at the right time, sidled up to him. "Hamish," she said softly, "think you're looking in the wrong direction." She handed him a scrap of paper she had accidentally found tucked behind a chair. It was a receipt for a whiskey bottle, expensive, purchased the night before Gerald's death, signed by a name Hamish did not recognise. His mind ticked over the details. Someone had been drinking with Gerald, someone not yet considered. That was where the motive hid, someone he would have to coax into revealing themselves. By late morning, Blair was ready to make an arrest, his chosen suspect scowling and protesting, utterly certain of their own innocence. Hamish watched, sipping his coffee and letting the clock mark time. The village itself seemed to lean in, waiting for the inevitable blunder. Outside, the snow reflected pale light into the room, illuminating Hamish's calm face against Blair's blazing frustration. It was going to take a subtle nudge to prevent the wrong person from being accused. Hamish decided it was time to mooch. Not aimlessly, not without purpose, but with a careful plan. A visit to the post office, a chat with the curry shop owner, and a casual stop at the church where the minister was decorating the modest tree. Each conversation could reveal an overlooked detail. He moved among the villagers, careful to appear distracted while actually noting small contradictions. A story told twice with a different detail. A glance toward the hotel that lingered too long, a sigh too heavily loaded to be innocent. The village, in its own way, was giving him the clues. All he had to do was listen. As the day wore on, the wind outside picked up again, shaking loose snow from the roofs. Blair continued to shout at his officers, convinced that noise would produce results. Hamish, meanwhile, was quietly building a picture of who had actually interacted with Gerald, what their motives might be, and how the apparent robbery had been merely a distraction. Somewhere in the calm, deceptive cold of Whodunit, the person who had killed Gerald was already nervous, unaware that their behaviour was being catalogued by the constable, who seemed least interested of all. By the time evening drew the mountains into long shadows and the lights of the hotel glowed warmly against the snow, Hamish had a list of possibilities, each far more plausible than Blair's. He returned to the hotel, hands tucked into his coat pockets, lugs at his side, appearing nothing more than a tired man going about his business. Blair was still loudly insisting on Dougie's guilt, and the villagers had begun whispering, eager to see the resolution of a drama far larger than Christmas should permit. Hamish sipped another cup of tea, eyes narrowing ever so slightly, and allowed himself a faint, private smile. The day's work was just beginning, and already he knew that the real culprit had underestimated Whodunit, underestimated him, and would soon make a mistake. And when they did, Hamish would be ready. Hamish awoke the next morning to a world made silver by frost, the village quiet, except for the occasional creak of snow-laden roofs settling. Luggs was already awake, pacing in circles and sniffing at the floor as if he, too, understood that the day promised disturbance. Hamish dressed slowly, tugging on his coat and boots, careful not to hurry. There was no need to impress anyone with urgency, especially Blair. He stepped outside, inhaling the cold, crisp air that carried the scent of wood smoke from chimneys and salt from the loch. The world seemed untouched, serene, but Hamish knew better. Beneath the calm, tension had begun to settle like a fog over Whodunit. At the station, Blair was already barking into the phone, red-faced and impatient, alternating between accusations and orders to unseen officers. Hamish poured himself a cup of coffee, the steam curling around his nose, and leaned against the stove. He watched Blair pacing, the man's anger loud enough to disturb the sleepy gulls on the loch. It amused Hamish slightly, though he did not let it show. Blair's certainty that Dougie Macpherson was the culprit was as predictable as the tides. Hamish knew it would take only a few gentle nudges for the truth to surface, but he would have to orchestrate them carefully. The first step was gathering information. Hamish wandered out of the station and toward the hotel, a casual gait that suggested he was merely taking in the morning air. Luggs padded quietly beside him. Villagers were already emerging from their cottages, eyes bright and curious, whispering among themselves. Each snippet of gossip was a thread waiting to be pulled. Hamish noted who spoke first, who hesitated, and who glanced toward the hotel with a mixture of fear and anticipation. By the time he reached the hotel, he had a rough map of conversations, half-lies, and tensions that might hold the key to Gerald Fitzroy Smythe's demise. Inside, Mrs. McLean bustled about, fussing over trays of breakfast that nobody had much appetite for. Hamish took a seat near the window, scones on his plate, Luggs curling at his feet. He listened while Blair barked orders at a reluctant constable. The English newcomer Mrs. McLean mentioned in passing had apparently been rather insistent about visiting the local church last night, asking questions about parish boundaries and old wills. Hamish sipped his tea thoughtfully, The church and its records could hold details overlooked by Blair, who seemed more concerned with appearances than facts. Priscilla Halberton Smythe, who had been lingering in the hotel with an air of purposeful distraction, joined Hamish at his table. "I've been thinking," she said softly, lowering her voice. "Gerald had enemies even before he arrived. People who didn't like his attitude, his questions, his insistence that things change." She tapped a finger against the cup rim. "And I found something that might help." From the folds of her coat she produced a crumpled note, a receipt from the night before for a bottle of whiskey purchased under a name that did not belong to Gerald. Hamish's eyes narrowed. Someone had been drinking with him, someone intent on misdirection, and they had left the evidence behind carelessly. Hamish made a mental note to check with the shopkeeper, a small man whose nervous twitch betrayed more knowledge than he would admit. Outside, the snow had softened underfoot, turning the streets to a treacherous sheet of ice. The villagers moved cautiously, aware that the police presence had turned the normally lazy day into something tense. Hamish strolled along, nodding politely to neighbours, pretending to take in the scenery while cataloguing every small slip in behaviour. An argument overheard at the bar, a glance too quick. Toward the hotel window, a twitch of the lips when discussing Gerald. These were not trivial details. They were the signs someone left when guilt pressed too tightly. By mid-morning, Hamish had constructed a tentative picture. Gerald had arrived arrogant and demanding, upsetting the balance of Whodunit. He had interacted with locals, some welcoming, others hostile. He had been drinking, and someone had taken advantage of the evening's confusion. The apparent robbery was a facade, a neat distraction to obscure the true motive. Hamish paused near the church, watching the spire pierce the winter sky. Somewhere within those walls or among those villagers lay the answer, hidden behind politeness and small-town discretion. He returned to the hotel, where Blair was growing increasingly frustrated. The DCI had gathered a small crowd, pointing at Dougie and declaring his guilt with absolute confidence. Hamish ignored him, retreating to a corner with another cup of tea, lugs at his side. He listened to whispers and half-conversations, picking up that someone had seen Gerald arguing near the old pier the night before, and that a local woman, quiet, unassuming, had left the area suspiciously early. That was enough for a start. The killer had underestimated Whodunit, underestimated the constable who pretended to do nothing as afternoon approached. Hamish moved among the villagers with the casual ease of someone who belonged, gathering subtle contradictions and overlooked details. Blair, meanwhile, was preparing to arrest Dougie, certain he had cracked the case. Hamish allowed himself a private smile, knowing that the true culprit would slip soon enough, tripping over their own lies or arrogance. By the time the light faded and the first hints of evening crept across the loch, Hamish had a clearer sense of direction. Someone had acted out of spite, someone with knowledge of Gerald's habits, someone who could not resist the temptation of petty revenge. He returned to his chair by the fire, sipping tea, letting the snow fall silently outside, and listened. The villagers' whispers carried a rhythm, small but insistent, guiding him toward the truth. Blair continued to shout, oblivious to the careful web being woven around him. Hamish leaned back, eyes half closed, appearing as lazy and uninterested as ever, while in reality, every detail, every glance, every slip of speech was being stored in his mind. Christmas had brought a body, and Whodunit demanded an answer. Hamish Macbeth was patient. He would wait until the right moment, and when it came, the killer would reveal themselves. Until then, he sipped his tea, quietly in control, unnoticed, and perfectly content. Hamish spent the rest of the afternoon moving quietly through Whodunit, keeping to the edges of the hotel crowd while pretending to check his notebook, which contained nothing of importance except for doodles and a few hastily scribbled reminders. Lugs followed closely, nose twitching at every scent, ears alert to conversations that might slip out too quickly. Blair was still loudly berating Dougie Macpherson at the hotel entrance, convinced the man's nervous glances were proof of guilt. Hamish, as always, ignored the noise, letting it wash over him while he observed the subtler signs of stress in the village. People spoke differently when they were afraid or hiding something. Some spoke too much, others too little. Hamish listened. That was his real work. At the post office, he found the shopkeeper rearranging letters, pretending to be busy, but glancing constantly toward the hotel. "Morning, Mr. Macbeth," he said, his his voice tentative. Hamish nodded in reply, casually leaning on the counter. "I hear someone was buying whiskey last night," he said. The shopkeeper blinked. "Aye, a bottle. For Mr. Fitzroy Smythe," he admitted, eyes flicking toward the window. "Paid by, well, not by him exactly." Hamish made no reaction, simply filed it away. Someone had bought the whiskey for Gerald, perhaps to soften him up or to distract him. And that person had signed under a false name. Nothing here yet tied directly to murder, but it narrowed the field. Hamish moved on, strolling down to the little curry shop that served more gossip than food. He greeted the owner with a lazy wave, ordered a small plate to keep appearances, and let the conversation drift toward the night before. "Did anyone eat here late?" he asked casually. The owner wrinkled his nose, thinking. "Aye, 2 men, English one and a local, I think. Arguing about land and the whiskey." He spilled some on the floor. Hamish noted the timing. Late night, argument, alcohol, private conversation, a combination likely to end badly if emotions ran high. By mid-afternoon, Hamish was walking along the frozen loch, letting the wind clear his mind. Snowflakes clung to his hair, and the mountains rose dark against the pale sky, patient and unjudging. Blair was still inside the hotel, preparing to arrest Dougie, with a self-satisfied grimace. Hamish could almost hear the headlines forming in Blair's mind. "Local man confesses, DCI Blair cracks Christmas murder." He shook his head slightly, smiling under his breath. Not yet. He needed one more piece of the puzzle, and it was likely hiding in plain sight. He returned to the hotel lobby just as a faint commotion began near the stairs. A young woman from the village, shy and quiet, was being questioned by one of Blair's constables. Hamish edged closer under the guise of adjusting the firewood. The woman's hands trembled slightly, and her eyes darted toward the hotel windows. I didn't mean to," she stammered. Hamish listened carefully. "She mentioned seeing someone near the pier late that night, someone not part of the hotel party, arguing with Gerald. That detail fit perfectly with the scattered clues he had already gathered. A person local, unseen by most, who had motive, opportunity, and knowledge of Gerald's habits." Hamish moved outside again, watching the loch as the sun dropped lower, the water darkening, reflecting the pale sky. He thought of the missing glove, the whiskey, the false signature, the altercation near the pier, and the reaction of villagers when they discussed Gerald. He knew who the killer was. The person who seemed invisible, the one everyone overlooked, had acted out of a mixture of spite and petty revenge. Nothing grand, nothing about land deals or riches, just the satisfaction of putting the arrogant outsider in his place. Hamish smiled faintly, lugs padding silently at his side. The trap would have to be simple. The killer had overestimated their cleverness, underestimated the village, underestimated him. Returning to the hotel, he passed Blair, who was in full theatrical mode, preparing to confront Dougie. Hamish gave a small nod, as if checking in on an old friend. Blair took it as permission to continue, unaware of the constable's quiet plan. Hamish approached Mrs. McLean for another cup of tea, allowing the kettle to hiss in the background while he thought. The killer would reveal themselves if handled carefully. No arrests, no shouting, no evidence planted. Just subtle pressure, the right question, asked at the right time. Hamish knew the village better than anyone, and he knew that guilt, even the smallest, would show in actions, not words. Evening settled over Loch Dhu, drawing shadows long across the snow. The villagers had mostly returned indoors, leaving the hotel quiet except for Blair's endless agitation. Hamish, leaning against the wall, let his gaze wander over the gathered people, noting each flicker of unease, each twitch that betrayed concern. He sipped his tea and allowed himself a private smile. The real story was always in the little things, in the moments no one expected to matter. And tonight, one such moment would arrive. One slip, one misplaced glance, one nervous comment, and the puzzle would solve itself. Hamish rose slowly, tucking the empty cup under his arm. Lugs stretching alongside him. He moved toward the staircase, intending to make a casual appearance near the gathering of villagers. Blair was still shouting instructions, red-faced, oblivious to the careful tension building in the room. Hamish's eyes scanned each face, noting the one who could not meet his gaze. He had patience. He had knowledge. And he had the village itself leaning toward confession in whispers and small, telling gestures. Christmas Eve had brought a body, yes, but it would also bring the revelation of truth quietly, without fanfare. Hamish adjusted his coat and smiled faintly. In Whodunit, nothing remained hidden forever. Lugs wagged his tail. The wind outside rattled the windows. And Hamish Macbeth waited, patient, certain, and unseen. Hamish lingered near the hotel staircase, pretending to adjust his coat while scanning the room with quiet intent. Lugs settled at his feet, ears pricked, nose twitching, attuned to the same subtle signals his master was watching. Blair, meanwhile, was in full theatrical mode, calling Dougie over with exaggerated authority and pointing toward the door, as if shoving him into guilt itself would make it stick. Dougie shuffled obediently, his face pale, his hands clutched together as if they might magically confess his innocence. The villagers watched from scattered corners, whispering in low tones, their curiosity heavy in the air. Hamish, standing just behind a pillar, observed every flicker of nervousness, every glance darted toward the hotel windows. One slip, one nervous habit, would betray the true culprit. The young woman from the village who had earlier witnessed the argument near the pier lingered near the door, her fingers twisting her scarf anxiously. Hamish let his gaze rest on her briefly, noting the subtle shift in her posture when Blair barked a question at Dougie. She glanced toward the staircase, and then back at the hotel foyer, a movement so slight most would have missed it. But Hamish caught it. Instantly. He made a quiet decision. This young woman would be important if he could encourage her to speak without fear of reprisal. For now, he let her remain under observation, pretending to sip tea while Lugs pressed against his leg as if reminding him of the practicalities of life. Blair's voice rose again, accusing Dougie of lying, and Hamish allowed a faint smile to cross his lips. The DCI's confidence was loud but brittle. He had chosen the obvious suspect, the one who drew attention simply by being nervous, while the real culprit blended seamlessly into the village's background hum. Hamish's mind mapped every movement, the discarded glove near the pier, the whiskey receipt signed in a false name, the fleeting argument overheard in the curry shop. Everything pointed to someone careful, observant, and underestimated. Exactly the kind of person who would think they could get away with murder. Hamish moved toward the bar area under the pretense of stretching his legs. The villagers murmured greetings as he passed, and he nodded politely, careful not to show any urgency. He caught snippets of conversation, a remark about Gerald's arrogance, a whispered complaint about the noise he had made, a fleeting mention of the pier late at night. Nothing outright, nothing accusatory, but the pattern began to emerge. The killer had been acting within the village's rhythm, unnoticed, slipping between polite chatter and casual greetings. Hamish noted how they had avoided the hotel windows during the day, careful to appear normal while waiting for the investigation to misdirect attention. Priscilla Halberton Smythe appeared beside him, her expression calm but purposeful. "I think I can help," she said quietly, glancing around before sliding a folded note into his hand. Hamish unfolded it and read quickly. A brief message from someone who had seen Gerald leave the hotel late that night with a local villager, carrying what appeared to be papers and a bottle of whiskey. The handwriting was hurried, the ink smudged, but the content was clear. Hamish's mind began to fit the pieces together. The argument had escalated to theft, or at least the appearance of it, but the real purpose was humiliation, a subtle lesson in the danger of arrogance within a tight-knit community. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, a thin flurry that coated the streets with fresh white. Hamish glanced toward the windows, watching for any sudden movement, any indication that the guilty party might be restless. There it was, a slight twitch of a curtain in one of the cottages, almost imperceptible, but enough to confirm his suspicions. The killer was watching, impatient or anxious, and had likely already decided that the investigation was proceeding too slowly. Hamish made a mental note to visit that house under a plausible pretext soon, gently guiding the person toward revealing more than they intended. Blair continued his loud performance, now pacing near the staircase, confident that Dougie's nervousness alone constituted evidence. Hamish allowed him this satisfaction. It would make the eventual revelation all the more dramatic. The villagers meanwhile remained subdued, aware that the tension in the room was as thick as the snow outside. Hamish sipped his tea, listening carefully, eyes drifting toward the small cluster of people at the rear. One face did not belong. One posture betrayed unease. The killer had been hiding in plain sight, invisible to anyone who only looked at the obvious. By mid-afternoon, Hamish had decided on a subtle plan. He would let Blair continue to parade Dougie as the supposed culprit, while he quietly encouraged small hints to slip from the real perpetrator. A casual question here, a misdirected remark there, and the pieces would fall together naturally. The young woman who had observed the argument could be nudged into repeating what she had seen without fear. The shopkeeper could mention the whiskey again, accidentally revealing the false signature, and the villagers, under the guise of casual gossip, would provide confirmation. Hamish trusted them to do exactly that, because no one wanted to see an injustice ignored in their quiet Highland way. As the light faded, turning the hotel windows into glowing rectangles against the encroaching dusk, Hamish leaned back, lugs curling at his feet. Blair was still haranguing Dougie, confident that the case was solved. Hamish's eyes scanned the room slowly, noting every movement, every micro-expression. One slip, one nervous glance, and the killer would expose themselves. He allowed a faint smile to cross his face. Patience, observation, and understanding of human nature had served him before. They would serve him again. The wind outside rattled the shutters, carrying snow across the streets, and Hamish Macbeth waited, quiet, alert, and invisible. He knew the moment was near when the truth would rise like smoke from the loch, and when it did, nothing Blair thought important would matter at all. Hamish waited until the hotel's warmth seemed to press the villagers into corners, drawing them close to gossip and tea, while Blair's voice cracked across the room, loud and accusatory. Dougie Macpherson fidgeted, muttering under his breath, terrified and confused. Hamish, standing quietly near the fireplace, watched the scene unfold like a slow-motion play. Every glance, every twitch of a lip, every hesitation told a story Blair could not see. The DCI's focus on the obvious suspect blinded him to subtler truths, the invisible patterns Hamish had been tracing since the morning. Patience was key. The killer, after all, would betray themselves in due course. Hamish's thoughts drifted briefly to Gerald Fitzroy Smythe. The man had been insufferable, arrogant, and careless with other people's patience. Yet even now Hamish could not feel satisfaction at his death. It was inconvenient, to say the least, disrupting the fragile rhythms of Whodunit at the most festive time of year. Still, the inconvenience was a puzzle, a layered one, and Hamish relished the challenge. The killer had acted out of human pettiness, perhaps jealousy, perhaps simple annoyance, but also with the cunning to avoid detection, at least until the proper pressures were applied. He glanced at Lugs, who lay under the table, ears twitching at the murmur of conversation, equally aware that something had shifted. Priscilla Halberton Smythe appeared at his side again, leaning slightly to speak over the DCI's barking. "I think you're close," she murmured, eyes sharp. "The person is worried, yes, but also proud. They won't confess outright. They'll slip if you let them think they're in control." Hamish nodded slowly, appreciating the subtlety of her insight. She handed him another scrap of paper, this one more detailed. A note passed surreptitiously that hinted at a meeting near the pier, a misunderstanding, and a person who had been left alone with Gerald shortly before his death. Everything fit, as it always did in Whodunit when one listened carefully. Hamish wandered casually toward the back of the room, letting Blair's theatrics fill the foreground while he observed from the periphery. A few villagers were lingering, watching with curiosity and thinly veiled fear. One figure, a quiet, unobtrusive local who had mostly kept to themselves, shifted nervously near the edge of the crowd. Their hand moved repeatedly toward the pocket of their coat, then withdrew, a subtle gesture, almost invisible, but enough for Hamish to raise an eyebrow. He knew that hand concealed something important, a small token of guilt, a hint meant to be overlooked. His mind worked swiftly, arranging details, checking each against what he had observed over the past 24 hours. Blair's voice rose again, accusing Dougie of lying about his alibi, gesturing wildly, but Hamish remained unmoved. He sipped his tea, listening to half-whispers, noting the small shifts in posture, the fleeting avoidance of eye contact. The young woman from the peer argument earlier glanced nervously at the figure he had noted, lips parting as if she might speak but holding back. Hamish approached her casually, asking after her day, commenting on the cold outside. Her relief at being addressed gently was visible, and she spoke quietly about what she had seen, giving away a key detail without realizing it. Hamish's smile was faint and private, but the picture became clearer. Gerald had been led into a false sense of security, distracted by whiskey and conversation, then left in a situation that the killer had orchestrated carefully. It had nothing to do with robbery, nothing to do with documents, just human spite, embarrassment, and the small satisfaction of teaching a lesson to someone who had thought himself above the village's unspoken rules. Hamish considered the simplest way to draw the culprit out. No confrontation, no overt questioning, just a carefully placed suggestion, a rumour, a planted seed that would grow into panic. He wandered near the back, deliberately letting his coat brush against the guilty figure, feigning a stumble. The reaction was immediate. A hand went to the pocket again, this time jerking sharply, eyes darting around as if seeking escape. That was all he needed. Hamish stepped back, hands raised in innocent acquiescence, allowing the figure's own anxiety to create the next move. Lugs's ears twitched, as if sensing the shift in energy, and the dog nudged gently against Hamish's leg, alert and ready. Outside, the snow continued to fall, light and persistent, blanketing the streets in soft silence. Inside, the villagers leaned slightly forward in their seats, drawn by the tension they could feel but not see. Blair continued to bark, unaware that the real thread of the investigation was unravelling quietly at the edge of the room. Hamish's eyes were on the nervous figure, noting every twitch, every swallowed breath, every glance at the door. The trap had been set. Soon the truth would emerge from the small, carefully observed cues of human behaviour. Hamish allowed himself another sip of tea, savouring the warmth and the calm it provided while his mind ticked steadily over the final pieces. The missing glove, the false signature on the whiskey receipt, the timing of the peer meeting, the nervous avoidance, all lined with one person, one simple petty motive. Blair's theatrics would only make the eventual revelation more dramatic, more satisfying for those who had watched carefully. As evening drew close, the hotel seemed to hold its breath. The low murmur of the villagers hushed in anticipation. Hamish stood, adjusting his coat with a casual air, and let his gaze rest on the figure he knew had acted out of arrogance and spite. The moment was near when the killer, overconfident and unseen, would make the smallest misstep. And when that happened, Hamish Macbeth would be ready. He had patience, understanding, and an intimate knowledge of the village's rhythms. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, carrying flakes of snow across the streets. Hamish smiled faintly, unseen, and waited for the inevitable confession, knowing that Whodunit's quiet justice was about to unfold. Hamish watched the guilty figure shift uneasily, their fingers brushing against the pocket that contained the last piece of evidence he needed. Every subtle gesture screamed the truth, though Blair remained blissfully unaware, pacing behind him, red-faced and self-assured. Hamish allowed a slow, casual smile to cross his face as he leaned against the back wall, sipping a cup of tea he had long since cooled to the perfect temperature for contemplation. The village's quiet whispers circled the room, hints of information floating almost unnoticed, like smoke curling toward the ceiling. Hamish catalogued each one, mentally arranging them into a map of opportunity, motive, and small-town grudges. The killer, he knew, was tense, aware of being watched, but confident in the illusion of invisibility. That confidence would be their undoing. Priscilla Halbert and Smythe appeared at his elbow, glancing toward the figure with sharp, perceptive eyes. "They know someone is onto them," she whispered, her breath slightly warm from the cold outside. "But they think it's Blair. They underestimate you." Hamish nodded subtly, taking another sip of his tea. Lugs shifted at his feet, quietly alert, sensing the tension in the room. Hamish's plan required patience, observation, and the quiet nudging of circumstances. Nothing overt, nothing confrontational, just the right pressure applied in the right way. And he had been doing just that all day, collecting threads and weaving them into a trap the killer could not resist. Blair, oblivious to the subtleties, had grown louder, his anger a constant drumbeat in the background. Dougie Macpherson remained the unfortunate scapegoat, his eyes wide and panicked as the DCI gestured wildly, pointing toward doors, windows, and imaginary clues. The villagers leaned in, curious and fearful, their whispers forming a quiet chorus of speculation. Hamish, meanwhile, drifted closer to the nervous figure, letting casual conversation fall around them like harmless snow, soft and unnoticed. He asked small questions, comments about the cold, about tea, about the local weather, everything designed to put the person at ease while subtly applying pressure. A bead of sweat formed at the guilty figure's temple as they shifted, eyes darting to the windows, then back to the fireplace, and finally toward Hamish. It was a micro-movement, barely perceptible, but enough. Hamish tilted his head slightly, offering a faint, friendly smile that was almost invisible to everyone else in the room. "I hear the pier is beautiful this time of year," he said softly, almost as if thinking aloud. "Quiet, peaceful, except when there's a bit of trouble." The words were casual, yet loaded. The killer's hand twitched toward their pocket again, this time unconsciously drawing out the evidence. Blair continued to shout at Dougie, oblivious, while the young woman who had witnessed the pier argument earlier shifted nervously near the door, her gaze flicking between the guilty figure and Hamish. She did not speak, not yet, but the tension in her posture suggested she might at any moment. Hamish smiled faintly. The timing was right. All he needed was the next small move, the tiniest misstep. The killer, confident in their invisibility, would make it without realizing it. Hamish's eyes tracked the subtle glances and small gestures, noting the direction of the guilty person's feet, the twitch of their shoulders, and the occasional half-breath that betrayed rising panic. He made a small, deliberate move toward the fireplace, brushing past the person casually, letting lugs nudge against their leg. The effect was immediate. A foot shifted, a hand went deeper into the pocket, and eyes darted upward, meeting Hamish's just for a fraction of a second. That was enough. The trap had begun to snap closed. Priscilla, noticing the shift, gave Hamish a slight nod, the acknowledgement of shared understanding passing silently between them. The young woman at the door moved forward slightly, gathering courage, while Blair, still shouting, remained oblivious to the currents running beneath the surface. Hamish took a slow, deliberate step back, giving space while maintaining a casual demeanour. The killer, now anxious, tried to adjust their posture, straighten their coat, and mask their discomfort, all in vain. Every micro-movement betrayed them further. The room seemed to hold its breath. Snow continued to fall softly. Outside, coating the streets in white silence, muffling the world beyond the hotel walls. Inside, tension vibrated in the air, unnoticed by all but Hamish and a few attentive villagers. He sipped his tea slowly, letting time stretch, drawing out the moment until the inevitable slip. The guilty figure's eyes darted, the hand twitched, the small note or token became visible just enough for Hamish to see it. He allowed a quiet, private smile. Soon the confession, or at least a reveal, would occur. Hamish moved slightly, leaning toward the figure as if interested in nothing more than casual conversation. "Cold night for a walk near the pier," he said softly. "Wouldn't want anyone to fall in the ice by accident." The words were innocent enough to pass unnoticed, but loaded enough to suggest subtle oversight. The guilty figure's breath hitched, a micro-expression of panic flickering across their face. They had underestimated the quiet constable who appeared to do nothing. They had assumed invisibility meant safety. A small, nervous sound escaped the figure. A shuffle, a cough, barely audible, yet Hamish heard it clearly. The young woman's eyes widened, and she leaned forward slightly, her lips parting as though about to speak. Lugs shifted at Hamish's feet, tail flicking, sensing the tension at the precise moment. Hamish allowed himself a slow exhale. The trap was working. The killer had no idea how completely they'd been ensnared, and Hamish, quiet, patient, and seemingly lazy, waited, ready to guide the final moments toward revelation. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, the snow fell heavier, and Whodunit itself seemed to lean closer, attentive, waiting for the small human justice about to unfold. Hamish felt the shift before it fully happened. The guilty figure, small and seemingly invisible throughout the day, finally allowed a fragment of panic to slip outward, a twitch of the hand toward the coat pocket that revealed more than they intended. Lugs, ever attentive, twitched his ears, and nudged Hamish's leg, prompting the constable to act with quiet precision. Hamish leaned forward casually, letting his presence press gently on the edge of the room, enough to encourage a reaction, but careful to avoid the dramatic spectacle Blair craved. The room itself seemed to contract around the tension, the murmurs of villagers dropping to hushed whispers, eyes darting between the anxious figure and the DCI, who remained blustering and oblivious to the subtleties at play. Priscilla, Halbert and Smythe, aware of the unfolding moment, stepped closer to Hamish, offering a barely perceptible nod. The young woman who had witnessed the peer argument earlier shifted again, her courage rising as she sensed the climax approaching. Hamish's mind raced quietly, cataloguing all the tiny gestures, a finger brushing an unseen object, the slight shiver of shoulders, the quickening blink rate. Every micro-expression pointed toward the same conclusion. He allowed himself the faintest of smiles, savouring the culmination of patient observation, the kind of work Blair would never understand. The DCI continued shouting at Dougie, completely missing the fact that the real culprit had already begun to unravel under the smallest, quietest pressures. Hamish moved closer, taking an almost imperceptible step toward the guilty person, letting casual conversation drift between them and the edge of the crowd. "You seem uneasy," he said softly, almost as if musing aloud. "Winter nights can be unsettling, especially near the pier." The words were innocuous, but the tone carried a gentle insistence. The figure's hand twitched again, this time betraying the hidden evidence, a small crumpled note that had been overlooked until now. Hamish's eyes narrowed just enough for the person to notice, and in that fraction of a second, the trap snapped, fear overtook cunning, and a tiny, involuntary gasp escaped their lips. Blair, still focused entirely on Dougie, was unaware of the shift. Hamish allowed him this satisfaction. The DCI's overconfidence would make the eventual revelation all the more dramatic. Meanwhile, the villagers leaned in, sensing tension without understanding its source. The young woman near the door took a small step forward, emboldened, and whispered what she had witnessed at the pier. Hamish caught the words effortlessly, filing them into the mosaic of truth he had been assembling since morning. The story became clear. Gerald Fitzroy Smythe had been drawn into a confrontation, distracted by alcohol and conversation, and left in a vulnerable position by someone motivated entirely by pettiness and social irritation, rather than any grand ambition. Hamish shifted slightly, letting Luggs nudge the guilty figure's leg under the table. The action was subtle, unnoticeable to anyone else, yet enough to amplify the panic. The person's fingers fumbled, brushing against the note again, and their face betrayed a flash of recognition. They had been caught, their invisible facade cracked. Hamish maintained a calm exterior, sipping his tea and allowing the tension to rise naturally. The smallest prompt, the faintest suggestion, was all that was needed to draw out a confession without overt confrontation. The young woman finally spoke aloud, confirming details of the argument and Gerald's last movements, her voice steady but quiet. Hamish nodded slightly, just enough to encourage her, while Blair, oblivious, continued his theatrics at the staircase. The effect was immediate. The guilty figure's eyes darted between the two, their composure unravelling. Hamish's patience had created the perfect moment. No shouting, no coercion, just careful guidance and subtle observation, allowing human nature to reveal what forced words could not. With a small sigh, the guilty person finally faltered entirely. I didn't mean," they began, voice trembling, eyes wide. Hamish leaned just enough to catch the words, letting them hang in the air while. The room seemed to stretch around the revelation. Blair, still loudly narrating Dougie's supposed guilt, paused for a fraction of a second, noticing the sudden shift in the room's energy, but misunderstanding it entirely. Hamish ignored him, focusing instead on the subtle confessions, the small details that confirmed what he had known for hours. The murder was not premeditated in the grand sense, but a petty human act, born of frustration and social pique. The villagers, sensing the truth, leaned closer, their whispered affirmations adding to the pressure on the culprit. Hamish guided the conversation delicately, asking about the pier, the whiskey, and Gerald's movements, in a calm, matter-of-fact tone. Each question drew more unintentional admissions, reinforcing the picture he had assembled. Lugs shifted at his feet, tail flicking slightly, sensing the tension reaching its peak. The guilty figure, now cornered not by force but by circumstance, could do nothing but reveal the entirety of their actions, piece by piece, without realizing how completely they had been observed. By the time the first snowflakes of evening swirled against the windows, the confession was complete. The small, petty motives had been laid bare: jealousy, irritation at Gerald's arrogance, the desire to assert dominance within the village social structure. Nothing grand, nothing ambitious, just a perfectly human crime hidden behind carefully constructed lies. Hamish allowed a faint smile, noting the rhythm of relief, panic and acceptance passing through the room. Blair, still unaware, continued to gesticulate at Dougie, who finally sagged in exhaustion, relieved to remain uncharged. Hamish set his cup down, finally allowing himself to stretch fully, satisfied with the delicate orchestration. Lugs nudged against him, tail wagging, as if acknowledging the quiet victory. The villagers, now murmuring openly about the resolution, turned toward the guilty figure, understanding at last that the deception had been uncovered. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters gently, snow drifting lazily across the streets, while Hamish Macbeth, calm and patient, surveyed the scene, knowing that justice had quietly unfolded, invisible to those who relied solely on noise and bluster. Hamish sat quietly in the corner of the hotel, Lugs curled at his feet, watching the guilty figure fidget under the collective gaze of the villagers. The confession had been drawn out gently, naturally, without the theatrics Blair so desperately craved. Every detail fit seamlessly into the puzzle Hamish had been assembling since that first frozen morning, the threads of small-town gossip, human pettiness, and casual observation weaving themselves into a clear picture. The culprit, flushed with embarrassment and exhaustion, admitted everything: the argument near the pier, the carefully staged scene with the whiskey, and the petty motives rooted in jealousy and social pique. It was, in every sense, a human crime. A moment of spite against Gerald Fitzroy Smythe, who had never learned the subtle rules of Lochdu's quiet order. Blair, still gesturing wildly toward Dougie, was momentarily silent as the villagers' murmurs turned into quiet, knowing conversation. Hamish allowed himself a faint smile, sipping his now lukewarm tea. The DCI had taken for granted that Dougie's nervousness and proximity to Gerald's last moments were proof enough. It amused Hamish to watch the realization wash over some of the villagers as they pieced together what he had quietly known all along. Blair would take credit in the papers, of course, and Hamish didn't mind. He had no desire to be transferred to Strathbane or anywhere bigger. The beauty of Lochdu was its slow pace, its people, and the small satisfactions of justice handled delicately. Priscilla Halberton Smythe approached, her eyes bright with quiet satisfaction. "You made it seem effortless," she said softly, careful not to disturb the fragile tension. Still lingering, Hamish shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "Effortless," he murmured. "If you ignore the hours of listening, watching and waiting, most people just see the part that looks like laziness." Lugs thumped his tail against the floor, as if agreeing. Hamish's method was simple: patience, subtle observation, and understanding human nature. No flashy forensics, no loud accusations, just knowing the village better than anyone, and knowing when a person's composure would betray them. Outside, the wind rattled gently against the hotel windows, snow falling softly over the quiet streets. The guilty party, now subdued but compliant, was escorted by the constables while Blair barked instructions, still convinced of his own dramatic role in the resolution. Hamish allowed himself the satisfaction of letting the DCI take the glory, knowing that the real work, the observation, the patience, the orchestration, had been entirely his. Lochdu's order was restored, and the quiet justice of the Highlands had been served without unnecessary fanfare or violence. With the room settling, Hamish moved to the window, looking out over the snow-dusted loch. The water reflected the pale evening sky, calm and undisturbed. It was as if the world had righted itself, snow covering the traces of disruption and human folly. The villagers returned to their homes, relieved, quietly discussing the events while maintaining the delicate balance of their daily lives. Hamish remained where he was, enjoying the sense of completion, the gentle satisfaction that came from knowing everything was as it should be. Priscilla joined him at the window, her expression softening as she followed his gaze. "And now?" she asked, What will happen next? Hamish let out a low, contented sigh. Now, he said slowly, we return to normal. Tea, coffee, and the quiet rhythm of Whodunit. Some people think that solving a murder means chaos, but here, it's just part of the village's life. He smiled faintly. Lugs. Resting his head on Hamish's boot, ears twitching with alert comfort. And if Blair writes the headlines, that's his concern. My concern is the village and my own cup of tea. As twilight deepened, Hamish wandered to the small kitchen, warming his hands over the stove, while the smell of freshly baked scones mingled with the faint aroma of simmering stew. Lugs stretched and settled nearby, and the world outside remained serene. The snow softened the sounds of the streets, muffling any lingering tension, while Hamish reflected on the events with quiet satisfaction. Justice had been done, subtly, humanely, and cleverly. No one had needed to shout, no one had needed to panic beyond what was natural. Everything had fallen into place because Hamish understood people better than anyone else. By the time the stars appeared over the highlands, bright and indifferent, the village was calm. Hamish poured another cup of tea, taking it to the small table by the window, Lugs's head resting on his knee. He watched the reflection of lights on the snow and the gentle ripple of the loch in the distance. Christmas in Whodunit had brought a murder, yes, but it had also reinforced the delicate order of the village and the quiet satisfaction of seeing truth revealed through patience and understanding. Blair would get the report, Dougie would return home, and the guilty party would face justice in due course. Hamish leaned back, sipping his tea, content. No headlines, no praise, just the comforting rhythm of the village and the soft crackle of the fire. In Whodunit, the world was small, predictable, and just, provided one knew how to listen. And Hamish Macbeth, quietly competent, patient, and deceptively lazy, had done exactly that. The village was safe, justice was served, and he could, at last, relax with a full stomach, a warm fire, and the loyal presence of Lugs. Outside, snow continued to fall, settling over rooftops, streets, and the loch, and Hamish allowed himself the faint, rare luxury of contentment. Whodunit had survived Christmas, and so had he, ready to return to his quiet, perfectly lazy life.